Hi everyone, Steve here with Ancestors in the Archives. In honor of Memorial Day, the Library of Congress is offering a transcription challenge for a set of letters written by Civil War veterans. These letters are part of a collection that was from a competition for left-handed penmanship due to the veterans having challenges writing with their right hand due to injury or amputation. It looks like a really interesting set of documents, and I'm going to provide a link to the article about it for anybody who's interested in reading about it or participating in the description below. Along those same lines, I'd like to talk today a little bit about my Civil War ancestors and some of the different sources that people can use to research their Civil War ancestors. The first is James Dundon. James spent his life around the Great Lakes. He was born in Ohio. He moved to New York where he met his wife and started his family. By the 1860s, he had made his way to Wisconsin, and in October of 1861, he enlisted as a sergeant in the 17th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. At that time, James was 40 years old. He was nearly 6 feet tall, 5 feet 11 3/4 inches. He had gray hair, hazel eyes, and was of a dark complexion. While he enlisted in 1861, his regiment didn't actually incorporate until March of 1862. And by the end of November of that same year, he was actually discharged for disability. He had been diagnosed with neuralgia, essentially nerve pain, and the regimental doctor said he was not like to get better, and he will never be fit for duty on account of the exposure to which he must necessarily be subject. He had apparently been unfit for duty for 4 months already, meaning he may have only served in combat from March until the beginning of August of 1862. Roughly 4.5 months. During that time, when he was on active duty, however, the regiment did take part in the Siege of Corinth in Mississippi, which he likely fought in. In the summer of 1863, the 17th Wisconsin Infantry took part in the Siege of Vicksburg, which was one of the most important battles of the Civil War, and along with Gettysburg, really marked the turning point for the Union forces. James, however, had made his way back home and was in Wisconsin safe and sound with his family. Another one of my Civil War ancestors is named Laura Jenks. And just to be clear, that is a male name, not a female. He spelled his name Lora, not Laura, like the female Laura name. Laura enlisted as a musician in the 13th Michigan Infantry in December of 1861, just 7 months after the events at Fort Sumter started the war. His muster rolls describe him as medium-sized, 5'7.5", with brown hair, blue eyes, and a light complexion. The 13th Michigan Infantry Regiment actually fought in the Siege of Corinth as well, which is the same place that James Dundon likely saw action. Another battle that they took part in was the Battle of Stones River, and I want to read a little bit from the regimental history to give you an idea of their actions during that battle. The 13th Michigan distinguished itself by its desperate valor and was most warmly commended for the heroic work that checked the onward rush of the Confederate forces. The Union forces were subtly pressed back by the enemy, but the 13th held its position until nearly surrounded, when it fell back a short distance and reformed, continually showing a bold front to the enemy. Colonel Shoemaker ordered a bayonet charge, and the 13th sprang forward with a yell, driving the enemy from the field in confusion and capturing a large number of prisoners. The regiment lost nearly 1/3 of its strength and killed and wounded in action on this part of the field. The regiment also took part in the Battle of Chickamauga, which was a major Union defeat in Georgia. Soon after that, in January of 1864, the unit veteranized, so all the soldiers were discharged with the option to re-enlist, and Laura was actually one of those who chose to re-enlist. Later that year, in September, one of his sons, Henry, would actually enlist in the 13th Michigan as well. A few months later, both Laura and his son Henry took part in the Savannah Campaign. You might know that better as Sherman's March to the Sea, which is one of the most infamous actions during the Civil War, where General William Tecumseh Sherman marched from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, leaving a wake of destruction in his path. While the war officially ended on April 9, 1865, with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, which everybody knows about, word was slow to spread of the defeat of the Confederate forces, and pockets of resistance continued on for weeks afterward. On the 26th of April, the 13th Michigan was with General Sherman when he accepted the surrender of General Joseph E. Johnson at Bennett Place, which is the largest single surrender of the Civil War. Both Laura and his son survived the war, mustered out, and went home later that summer. Right before he left for the war in 1861, Laura had another son and named him Lincoln. A baby boy, namesake to the president who led the country during that great Civil War, grew up for his first few years without a father. And that father believed in the cause enough not only to leave his family behind, including that little boy, but to re-enlist after 3 years of already treacherous service. Laura's daughter, Sarah Jane, however, was not so lucky. Her husband, Thomas Dickinson, also fought in the war, but died of typhoid fever near the end, and shortly thereafter she applied for a widow's pension. Which brings me to my next topic, what kind of records you can use to look through to find more information about your Civil War ancestors. The first, as I just mentioned, are pension files. Pensions can be applied for by the veteran themselves, their widow, or on behalf of their minor children. Pension files are really fantastic resources, and they contain a wide variety of documents and information. Sarah Jane's file, for instance, contains the marriage information for her and Thomas Dickinson. It also contains the marriage record for her to her second husband, Charles Smith, who is actually my third great-grandfather. That's the way I'm related in the line. There are all kinds of affidavits and witness statements from different relatives stating different relationships, from parents to siblings to in-laws. And there's even information related to Sarah's death in 1910. So her pension file ranges from the time she applied in 1865 to the time of her, well actually to the time right after her death, up until 1911. The second set of records I'd like to talk about are the compiled military service records. These aren't really standardized, but you can find documents in them such as enlistment papers, discharge papers, muster rolls. Sometimes you can find medical information. These are really great. Things like birthplaces are often mentioned on enlistment records, for example. And as you heard from me a little earlier, they can be really great places to find physical descriptions of people, which is a really great way to add character to some of your ancestors in a time where photographs weren't as common and you may not have any other way to know what these ancestors look like. Both the pension records and the compiled military service records can be found through the National Archives, and I'll put a link to the page that describes a little bit about those records in the description below. Finally, there are regimental histories. These give things like descriptions of the regiment's engagements, their officers, casualty lists, things like that. These are really interesting ways to learn more about the regiment, what your ancestor might have experienced during the war, and as you heard me read before, they can have really great descriptions of the battles sometimes. Usually these are compiled into books organized by states, and you can find them in various places online, places like Ancestry.com or different state archives. You can also find copies oftentimes in larger genealogical or local history collections in libraries. I think that's about it for today. I really want to say thanks for joining me as I talk a little bit about my military ancestors and maybe some of the ways that you can use different sources to learn a little bit more about yours. And I hope everyone out there has a great Memorial Day.